Welcome back to the channel, guys. A jig is an excellent way to catch bass all summer long, and as you can see behind us, we're not even offshore fishing. We're going to show you everything you need to know, 3 tips on this technique I'm doing today, how to catch big bass on a jig all summer long. We're going to get right back to it. So today we're going to be talking about jigs. I fish them all summer long. It's an excellent bait to catch big bass in the summer. As you can tell, we've been fishing some of those bluff walls. We're going to talk about that in today's video. We're going to give you 3 tips to help you catch more fish all summer long while fishing a jig. I've noticed later summer that these fish, when they're offshore, eventually they start to get pressured. We've had some cool nights. It's only 65 degrees right now, and it's the middle of August. Those fish know that fall is coming. It's not here yet. September is really when that transition will start, but those fish know it's coming, and some of them will leave early, those offshore places, and go up shallow, not necessarily shallow, but they'll go to the bank, and they'll start making their transition earlier than others because they know they'll get less pressure there. There's also a ton of food there. Some of the bait will transition faster. So those fish go right to the bank, they hang out, and they wait until they really make their transition and start feeding. And my favorite way to catch them this time of year and doing that technique is on a jig. So we're gonna talk about 3 tips. The first one is going to be your setup. So we're gonna break that down. There's a couple things I do to my jig this time of year to actually get more bites. And then we're gonna go out on the water. We're going to show you what we're looking at and how to fish this jig to make sure you're catching a lot more fish this time of year. So when it comes to the setup of this jig, we're not fishing football jigs. We've done that all summer. That's what those fish are getting pressured on offshore. Ultimately, a jig is a jig, but there's a couple things I do here to get more bites. The first thing, we got to talk about the rod and reel setup. Not very important in this sense, to be honest with you. Just get a 7'3" heavy jig rod, whatever you like to fish with jigs. I like a shorter rod. I'm making more accurate casts this time of year. Typically with a football jig, I'll fish up to a 7'6". This is a 7'3" here. Even a 7-footer would work just fine. You don't need a long rod. You just need something with a nice tip to be able to make accurate casts, and you need that heavy backbone to be able to set the hook on these big jigs here to make sure you can land these fish. The more important piece on this setup is actually your reel. So I have a 7:1 gear ratio reel here. I like something with a fast gear ratio to be able to pick up that line. A lot of times these fish will eat it, they'll swim right towards you. Not necessarily to work the jig fast. We're actually going to do the complete opposite, but it helps me pick up slack better, and more importantly, helps me land some of those fish. Had a couple today. You'll lift up to feel your baits on the bottom, and it's already halfway underneath the boat, and that fish is coming straight out with it. For some reason, they love to do that. They swim right off the bank. Don't know why, but a fast gear ratio will help you land more fish doing that. And then you got to have 20-pound test fluorocarbon. Could get away with 17 if you have sparser cover, but I love 20 this time of year. And anytime I'm fishing a big jig like this, especially in heavier cover, we're fishing a lot of laydowns, fishing a lot of wood, a lot of brush piles. I don't want to break off. I want to use some heavy pound test, especially if you're fishing around some bigger bass as well. When it comes to the jig itself, the number one thing you need is a 1/2 ounce jig. I do not mess with a 3/8 this time of year. The fish are active, they're moving around, they're feeding, the water's warm, everything's moving fast. So does your jig. Your jig needs to move fast too. Not necessarily to work fast and cover a lot of water, but to get reaction bites. If you flip it into a piece of wood, sometimes these fish will be suspended when we're fishing, where we'll talk about in these areas later on some of this deeper wood. Those fish might be suspended up in the wood over the depth of water. If that jig falls past their face really fast, they have to make a decision whether they're going to eat it or let it swim away. Usually they will just eat it because they don't want to let anything get away. They're opportunistic feeders. If a bluegill's coming by, they will absolutely crush it. I had one today. I was burning my bait in, and it came up to the surface and just crushed the thing because it didn't want to let it get away. I caught it over like 18 foot of water just reeling it in. So these fish like the faster fall. That's what they're going to be looking for, and it allows you to fish more effectively on these areas because you want to keep this bait on the bottom. So my jig of choice is going to be a 6th Sense hybrid jig. The reason I like this one, again, over some like football style jigs, is because it has that pointed head with the banana shape. It's going to help it come through wood much better. You're not going to get hung up. The only way you're really going to hang this jig up is if you throw it into some really brushy logs up on the bank or some brush piles. If you bury it in there and really cast it too far in where you probably shouldn't have with a jig, or if you set the hook into wood. That's the only way I've really got these jigs hung up. That pointed head really helps it come through that wood. I'm using like a green pumpkin blue here. Color does not matter, to be honest with you. Make it look like a bluegill, that's usually what they're eating. There might be some craws around too, but in the summertime, they're bluegill eaters for sure. So you really want to have a bluegill looking bait. I pretty much go black and blue or green pumpkin. Those are going to be the two colors that I like to fish the most. The more important thing I do with my jig this time of year, it's something that not a lot of people talk about. I've talked about it a few times on the channel, and I mismatch my jig trailer. So I actually have a black and blue jig trailer on this green pumpkin jig. Ultimately, anything in nature is not one color. So this looks like a bluegill to me, and probably will to a bass, because it has the blue highlight, it has the green pumpkin, it has some purple, it has some copper, it has some black in it, and then it has the black and blue trailer. Has a whole mottled look. It could look like one of those spawning bluegills you see all the time. They have that big orange belly, all that kind of stuff. Those bluegills are never drab one color. So I like to throw something just a little bit different. The other thing is these fish have been getting a ton of pressure, and the most common thing to do with your jig is to throw a green pumpkin jig and a green pumpkin trailer, or a black and blue jig and a black and blue trailer. If you try just something a little bit different, you're not changing your bait entirely. You're not changing the presentation. You're still throwing a 1/2 ounce jig, but it's just a different color, completely different from what everyone else is throwing it. The trailer's a different color. Just that little change sometimes can get you more bites on a very pressured body of water. So the first tip that we're going to focus on when we're fishing this jig is actually the location we want to fish it. And as you can see, doesn't matter whether you're fishing from the bank or a boat, these are the types of banks that we're going to look for. You want to look for the steepest banks in your lake. So right here, we have these banks, big cliff walls, trees hang way out over the edge of it here, and there's actually fallen wood underneath. That's the key to this technique. Not a lot of people notice that big one that I just caught right there at the beginning of today's video, that was on a piece of wood that was way out off the bank. I could see it on my 360, pitch to it, and catch some fish. You don't need 360 to do this. All I'm doing is casting my bait to the bank on these steeper banks and slowly working it down. If you were fishing from shore, you would just do the opposite. You'd cast out and bring it back. The thing with these steeper banks is that when these trees fall, or even limbs, they fall and sink all the way to the bottom here, but we're in 12, 13 foot of water, so these fish can live really deep and get that deep water they need, but it's literally right next to the bank. Like, I can cast and hit the bank and bring it all the way out, and I can catch a fish anywhere in between here. That's just the type of areas that they're going to live in this time of year. So what these fish will do, and the key with these trees specifically that I'm fishing today, which doesn't have to happen on your lake, just a steeper bank with some pieces of wood down in the water will work just fine. These ones hang way out over and always have shade underneath, so it gives them a place to hide, and it's always cooler underneath these trees than anywhere else on the lake, so they're always going to hang on this here. The other thing is this creek channel runs this entire bank all the way up the lake, so this is the creek channel bank that they swing on. This is a perfect wintertime area actually, so fish would actually hang out here in the wintertime as well, because there's a steep bank and there will be food that will hang in the creek channel here. So this same places you would target in the winter, let's target them late summer. I've noticed the later the summer, typically July, August, even September, that's when this pattern really starts to shine. These fish will pull up on these walls. Those deep fish that have been getting pressured on offshore spots, if you're fishing on a bigger lake, they'll start to have enough. They're going to know that fall is coming, and they're going to start their transition early, and they're going to move up on these banks, and you'll be able to catch them on this jig like this. Now, when it comes to actually fishing this bait, this could not be an easier technique to do. I'm skipping this jig around, but like I said, if you don't have this overhanging trees, you wouldn't have to skip it. You can just cast to the targets. So I have a piece of wood right here. I'm going to cast my bait right next to that piece of wood, and I'm going to watch my line and make sure that bait hits the bottom. Like we're talking about, we're fishing deeper banks. This bait might have to sink a little bit to get down to the bottom. So I'm going to watch it, let it hit the bottom. There's a bass blowing up on bait right there. We're going to catch him next. Now this thing has hit the bottom, and all I'm going to do is slowly drag this thing. And like I've shown you on this 360 here, there are pieces of wood that have fallen in the bank out here, and they're laying out in deeper water. So you might not see it, you might not know where it is. I can't even see every piece with my 360, so I fish my jig really slow. I'm not hopping it like I would like this, like if I'm flipping bushes. I'm not hopping my jig back to me. I'm not swimming it. I want this bait to stay on the bottom the entire time. So all I do is throw it up to the bank there and just slowly drag it. And the key is these banks are shelved, so they'll come out a little bit and then drop, and come out a little bit and drop. You want to fish it down those shelves too. So I'll pull up and I'll feel it dragging along the bottom, and it just came off the shelf right there. So I'll watch my line until it falls back down to the bottom, and then I'll drag some more. Those pieces of wood will fall on different parts of the shelf as well. So they might be on the second shelf or the second drop off the actual bank, or they might be right up on the bank. You never know where these fish could be, especially in the summertime. On a cooler day, they might move up. This is such a steep bank, they can move quickly. So on one day they might be up on the bank, the next day they might be all the way at the bottom of the shelf. They might be on the piece of wood that's in the middle of the shelf the next day. You have to fish your jig the entire way. So all I'm doing is slowly dragging this thing on the bottom like this and feeling for the bottom. That was a piece of wood, I came off the shelf, and I'm going to let it fall right back down. And then I'm going to drag it again, and I'll work it out a good distance until where you're fishing from a boat. If you're fishing from a shore, you can hit the bank. You'll be pulling it uphill, you'll hit the bank the whole way. When you're fishing from a boat, you want to cast it to the bank, drag it so far. Once I get it to this point, I'm actually pulling my bait up rather than across the bottom. So then I will reel in and make another cast. So I'll reel this back in. I'll go ahead and throw it under this tree here. I'm gonna let it sink down to the bottom. That was pretty shallow. I got it all the way up to the bank, so that hit the bottom pretty quickly. I'm gonna go ahead and start my dragging retrieve. And when we talked about that trailer selection, choosing the right one that moves a lot of water without a lot of effort is key on this technique, because you're not really moving your bait that much. You're letting it drag on the bottom. The only activity that bait's gonna get is when it comes off a shelf and falls. Those claws will go crazy when it falls off a shelf, because you have that 1/2 ounce jig pulling it down and making it have a lot of action. Other than that, when you're just dragging it on the bottom, it's going to have minimal action. So you need a trailer that can do a lot of work without a lot of effort. And like I've talked about, the biggest key with this technique is just to slow down and take your time. The nice part is these are such high percentage areas. You can tell what a steep bank looks like with your eyes. You can tell what pieces of wood are up on the bank. You don't need electronics to do this or anything fancy. Pick out the highest percentage targets on a steep bank where these fish need to be, preferably if it has some bait around, and make your cast, make them deliberate, and make multiple casts. That's one of my biggest things. If I see a piece of wood that looks really good and think there has to be a fish there, I'll make 3, 4, 5 casts from different angles, all around different sides. You might have to pull it through with the right tree branch that that fish is hanging in to get them to bite. Some days they might be more aggressive than others, but some days they might not. And you just really need to take your time and fish slow. It's not a covering water technique. You're not going to fish a lot of water doing this, mostly because you know what the fish are on. You're not trying to find the fish. They're going to be on these steep banks, and it's really easy to find them. So take your time, fish slowly, and catch a bunch of fish, and this technique will treat you right all summer, especially the later summer months. You'll catch a bunch of bass doing this, and I've caught some giant ones doing this in the summer as well when everyone else is fishing offshore. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video talking about how to fish a jig for summertime bass. If you did, go ahead and check this video out right here where I just talked about another technique that works awesome for summertime bass, whether you fish from the bank or a boat as well. It'll have you catching a bunch of fish all summer long. Leave a like down below if you enjoyed today's video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my fishing videos coming up. Thanks for watching.